Well, Jim, here's your patient, all ready for a tooth contact pattern check. Are you ready to operate?
Well, I'm ready, Herb, but the rear axle work is sort of new to me. I'm not too sure about pinion settings, gear tooth patterns, and all that.
Well, it does seem a little complicated, but once you understand the way hypoid gears work and how to use the special tools, you'll know what to do. Besides, Tech is right here to see that we do the job properly, right, Tech?
Right you are, Herb. But before we start, I want to shoot down some wrong ideas about axle noise. Now, no matter what you've heard, noisy axle gears will not get quieter by wearing in. The noise will stay the same or will get worse depending on the cause. Another point to remember. New low-mileage gears, which have run less than about 500 miles at normal break-in speeds, can be readjusted to reduce noise. In many cases, you can get rid of excessive noise caused by incorrect gear setting if you reposition the gears before a wear pattern develops.
In other words, you're saying that we should check the gear tooth contact pattern as soon as noise is reported and reset the gears if necessary, instead of telling the customer to put on more mileage and hoping the noise will go away.
Correct. Once the gear teeth start to wear in, it's usually too late to correct noise by adjustment, and you'll have to install a set of new gears. Are you still with us, Jim?
Yep, except I'd like to know more about rear axle gear noises.
Well, first of all, axle noises are hard to describe, so it's easy to misunderstand a noise complaint. I always test drive the car with the owner so he can point out the exact sound that's bothering him. But even when you know what it sounds like, you may have trouble deciding whether the noise is rear axle gears or something else, like bearings, tires, universal joints, transmission, or maybe even the engine.
With all those possibilities, how do you know where to start looking?
By using the process of elimination, Jim. Some noises are hard to track down, but you can usually sort out axle gear assembly sounds from other noises if you drive the car. In a road test, you'll find that axle shaft bearing noise continues when the car is coasting on smooth pavement with the engine shut off and the transmission in neutral. The noise decreases as the car slows down, but usually continues until the car almost stops. Here's another test you can make. Vary the axle shaft bearing load by swerving the car from side to side while coasting. If the noise increases when you shift the load, it's probably coming from the axle shaft bearing on the loaded side. Now for axle gear noise.
Whoa, hold there, Herb. Before you go on with road testing, Jim should know that all axle sounds don't mean trouble. All axle gears make some noise, but most drivers are not disturbed by it. For example, if the sound is light, more like a tone than a noise, and only comes in over a limited speed range, the sound is probably normal. Explain this to the customer and assure him that it is normal and doesn't mean trouble.
Thank you, Tech. Now, Jim, on your test ride, if you're satisfied that the axle shaft bearings are okay and the noise has a heavy grinding sound, you've probably got a bad set of gears, bad bearings, or both. You'll have to get into the axle to find the trouble.
After you've overhauled a few axles and analyzed the cause of trouble, you'll be able to tie in certain axle noises with specific gear or bearing conditions. Now I think it's time to explain how hypoid gears work. How about it, Herb?
Okay, Tech. That's a good way to get into tooth contact patterns and pinion setting. Jim, the main thing to understand is how the hypoid teeth mesh, so you can appreciate the importance of correct gear setting. To simplify things, let's begin the explanation with plain straight-tooth spur gears. Now, at any one instant, the meshed teeth contact at only one point or line across the tooth faces. As the gear teeth mesh, the tooth contact line travels toward the base or flank of the tooth. Then, as the teeth unmesh, the contact line moves back toward the top or face of the tooth. The wiping movement of the contact line develops a rectangle-shaped contact pattern on the gear teeth. In hypoid gearing, line contact between the teeth has the same wiping movement as in spur gears. Only here, as a result of hypoid gear design, the contact line develops an oval or teardrop contact pattern. Now, the full load on each gear tooth is concentrated on the moving contact line. If this line reaches any edge of a gear tooth, the heavy load will cause noise and heavy wear, and may even break the metal at that point. That's why the contact pattern must be centered on the gear teeth.
All right, men. How about showing me how you do a tooth contact pattern test? What'll it be? Red lead or white?
White lead shows up better on these dark gear teeth. I'll have the drive and coast sides of all the drive gear teeth coated in just a minute. Boy, this stuff is gooey. It's thicker than toothpaste.
Well, it works best that way. And take it easy with that brush. If the lead paste is too thin or the coating's too heavy, you'll get a smear instead of a clear pattern.
Before you check the pattern on gears that have been in service, be sure to clean the gears thoroughly with mineral spirits and blow them dry before you apply the lead. Gear lube on the teeth will make the pattern smear. And don't forget, on any tooth contact test, if the pattern doesn't look right on the first try, recoat the gear teeth and repeat the test before you go any further. Correct pattern testing takes a little practice, so if there's any doubt, double check to be sure.
Those are good points, Tech. Now, Jim, the drive gear must resist the turning force of the pinion so the gear teeth can form a distinct contact pattern. You can make the gear turn hard by prying with a round bar or large screwdriver between the carrier housing and the differential case rim. However, the shape and position of the contact pattern will change if the load on the drive gear varies. So when rechecking the pattern after a gear adjustment, you must try to use the same load for each test, or the pattern will be misleading. Now, turn the pinion to rotate the drive gear one full turn in each direction, so you'll get a contact pattern on both the drive and coast sides of the gear teeth. But don't rotate the gear more than one turn each way, or the pattern will be misleading. The tooth contact pattern should be the same on every tooth. Where the pattern shows heavy and light areas, be sure to check the drive gear and differential case for excessive runout. If pinion depth and gear backlash settings are correct, the heaviest, most distinct part of the contact pattern should be well centered on both the drive and coast sides of the drive gear teeth. The pattern feathers out toward the ends of the teeth and is less distinct.
Just remember that you're trying to get both the drive and coast side patterns as near to center as possible. If the tooth contact pattern is okay on one side but off on the other, you can end up with a noisy axle.
Thank you, Tech. Now let's check the tooth pattern on this axle. It looks like we've got a good pattern on both sides of the teeth, Jim.
Well, this contact pattern is close to center, all right, but more of it seems to be near the toe ends of the teeth.
That's because it's a test load pattern, Jim. When the gear is under operating loads, the tooth contact area spreads out, especially toward the heel of the tooth, which explains why the heavy part of the test pattern must be centered to begin with.
Okay, what's the next move if the contact pattern is off-center?
Well, the basic adjustment for correcting an off-center pattern is resetting the pinion depth of mesh. To do this, you'll have to install a thicker or thinner spacer washer under the pinion head and then reset the backlash. For instance, where tooth contact is high on the heel end of the drive side and also high on the toe end of the coast side, a thicker spacer washer is needed to move the pinion in toward the center of the drive gear. Increasing spacer thickness will move the contact pattern on both the drive and coast sides toward the center of the drive gear teeth. At the same time, the pattern moves down toward center, but this movement is smaller.
And that brings us to the place where someone will have to turn the record over to the contact pattern on the other side.
Now, in the opposite condition, where tooth contact is low on the toe end of the drive side and low on the heel end of the coast side, the pinion must move out, away from the drive gear center, so a thinner spacer is needed. With a thinner spacer washer, the contact patterns again move inward from the heel and toe ends of the tooth. However, in this case, moving the pinion out moves the pattern up toward the tooth center.
You can change tooth contact positions slightly by varying the backlash adjustment within specification limits. However, this is only a fine adjustment, so don't try to use it as a substitute for pinion resetting. Now that we've covered gear noise diagnosis and tooth contact testing, why don't you show Jim where to look for causes of axle noise and how to use the rear axle setting gauge tool?
Coming up, Tech. The teardown analysis on any axle should start by checking the lube level, because it doesn't take long for dry gears to score and wear. If the level is low, look for leaks, especially at the pinion and axle shaft seals.
This is a good place for a caution about axle shaft oil seals. If you're going to take out the differential assembly, remove the axle shafts completely and store them in a clean place. If they're pulled out only part way, the unsupported shaft ends will damage the inner oil seals, and you'll get a lube leak after you reassemble the job.
Before you take the gear assembly apart, you should check for differential bearing end play as described in the service manual. If the indicator needle moves, you'll probably find a differential bearing loose on its hub and signs of wear between the bearing cone and the case shoulder. If there's no differential end play, then check the drive gear and differential case separately for runout. This is especially important if you found an uneven pattern on your tooth contact test. Mark the gear and differential case at the point of highest runout for later reference.
And just to make sure you're on the right track, when you're inspecting a noisy axle, check for matching numbers on the pinion and drive gear. Unmatched gears will cause gear noise. This isn't common, but it's worth remembering. Be sure to mark the differential bearing caps and pedestals so you can reinstall the caps in their original positions. If the caps are switched, the bearing bores and adjuster threads will not match properly.
When the differential assembly is removed, check the bearing cones for a tight fit on the case hubs, even if no end play was indicated earlier. Squeeze the rollers against the cone and try to turn the cone. If the case hubs are worn so the cones can turn, a new case and bearing assembly must be used. Also make sure the drive gear and differential case are clearly marked to show the gear position on the case. Then unbolt the drive gear, keeping in mind that the screws have left-hand threads. Remove the gear by tapping it evenly around the edge with a soft-faced hammer.
This is also a good time to check differential side gear clearance. To make the most accurate measurement, insert 2 thin, flexible feeler blades of the same thickness between the differential case and side gear on the drive gear side. Then, take up the remaining clearance on the opposite side gear in the same manner. If the total end play clearance measured by the feeler blades exceeds 24 thousandths, install new thrust washers.
Finally, check the pinion for end play before removing it from the carrier housing. End play here will cause noise and gear tooth wear if the axle is operated for many miles in this condition.
Be sure you use the recommended special tools anytime you remove or install the pinion shaft companion flange. If you hammer on the back of the flange to remove it, you can damage the flange so the universal joint will not run true. Hammering can also damage the pinion bearings. And don't hammer on the front of the flange to install it on the pinion shaft. You'll only distort the flange so the parts won't fit together properly when the universal joint is reconnected. Hammer blows can also put noise-causing flat spots on the teeth of the pinion and drive gear.
How can I tell if bearings are reusable?
A good used bearing shows a uniform wear track in the cup with no flat or rough spots on the rollers. A uniform dull gray appearance in the roller path is normal for a good used bearing. Replace bearings only if you find spalling or signs of overheating, cracks, or other damage.
Make sure there are no chips, dirt, or burred surfaces in any of the bearing bores. Dress off any high spots on the sides and ends of the bores so the bearing cups can be installed correctly without cocking. Be sure to check the journal of the companion flange where it contacts the pinion shaft oil seal. If the surface is rough or grooved, install a new flange, even if the groove is smooth. And that takes care of differential assembly trouble spots. Now Jim should be ready to learn how the axle setting gauge tool is used.
It's possible to select the correct pinion spacer washer by trial and error, but you'd have to build up the differential assembly completely and run a tooth contact pattern test for each spacer you try. To make spacer washer selection easier, use the axle gauge setting tool in place of the pinion and drive gear. With the gauge parts installed in the carrier housing, you simply insert different spacers between the two measuring points of the gauge until you find the correct spacer thickness.
Before you get into spacer washer selection, Jim should know that the setting gauge tool is also used to seat the pinion bearing cups in the carrier housing. The accuracy of the pinion position and bearing preload both depend on properly seated bearing cups.
Right, Tech. First we lube the bearing bores, cups, and roller assemblies. Then, with the tool and bearing parts aligned in the carrier housing, tighten the tool compression nut until the cups are seated. While tightening, be sure to rotate the whole assembly to protect the bearings. Now, as you probably know, the pinion depth spacer and preload shim setup is the same for both of our 8 3/4 inch axles. However, the preload adjustment comes first with the small stem type, while the pinion depth setting is first with the large stem type. When the bearing cups are seated, leave the tool in the carrier for the next step, which is bearing preload adjustment with this small stem pinion. Set up the tool and bearings with the pinion bearing spacer and shim stack as described in the service manual, and check the preload.
The preload reading with new bearings should be 20 to 30 inch-pounds, or with used bearings 5 to 15 inch-pounds. If the reading is too low, use a thinner shim pack. A high reading calls for a thicker shim pack.
Next, with the tool still in place, turn the carrier nose down so you can select the correct pinion spacer washer. To do this, you install the gauge block on the tool head. Make sure the flat section of the block is next to the bearing pedestal. After that, center the crossbore arbor in the differential bearing pedestals and loosely install the bearing caps. Slide pieces of 2/1000 inch shim stock between the tube and the bearing caps, and then torque the bolts to 10 foot-pounds. Select a pinion spacer washer that fits between the gauge block and the crossbore arbor with a definite drag. Be sure you hold the washer flat against the block when you check the fit, or the selection may not be correct.
The spacer washer you select will be correct only if the pinion end is marked with a 0. If the pinion has a plus mark, you'll have to use a spacer that's thinner by the amount marked after the plus sign. And where the pinion marking is minus, you'll need a thicker spacer. In either case, after you select the spacer and build up the differential assembly, you'll still need a tooth contact pattern test to double-check your work. Now I understand you've got a few axle shaft service cautions left over, Herb.
That I do, Tech. Don't be fooled into changing an axle shaft outer oil seal just because you find lube in a rear brake. Any lube that leaks out has to come past the inner oil seal first, so changing the outer seal will not solve the problem. When you pull out an axle shaft for any reason, it's good practice to install a new inner seal to guard against a leak later on. Whatever you do, don't use a torch to remove an axle shaft bearing or bearing retainer collar. If you do, the shaft can break because torch heat destroys the axle shaft heat treatment. Just remember that your customer's safety is in your hands when you work on his car. Don't take chances.
Well, I sure got the treatment on rear axle diagnosis all right, but like you said earlier, Tech, I'll have to do a few axle jobs so I can learn how to spot the cause of trouble and fix it in a hurry.
You've got the right idea, Jim. But now, it's time to ring down the curtain. This session should give all you master technicians out there a new slant on rear axle diagnosis and servicing. It's really not as tricky as it seems. Take a good look at your reference books for this session. You'll find more details on axle servicing, especially on tooth contact pattern testing and adjustments. This information, plus the step-by-step details in your service manuals, should help you handle any axle job that comes along. See you next month.